Hello people, welcome to another video here on the CodeDomain YouTube channel, and today we're doing something slightly different. You see, I spent the last couple of days playing on Board Game Arena, experimenting with different versions of an Izmir deck, trying to see if I could make some sort of control deck work in Beyond the Gates, but I had no success whatsoever. I think my elo is at around -500 by now. I just could not make this archetype work at all. So my plans for making a video about Akesha Control are down the drain, but it got me thinking, why does this playstyle not work? So that's what this video is about. We're gonna deep dive into the question if and how you could play a control deck in Altered, and there's a lot of things to talk about. First of all, what control means, because many people are severely misunderstanding that term. And then afterwards I'll get into what control looks like in Altered right now, what the problems are, and at the very end I'll show you some potential new cards I designed that I think would be great additions in later sets to solve the problems control has right now. That much for introductions. Now let's dive into today's question of how do I play control in Altered? What is control and how does it work in other games? If you go on Altered DB or any other decklist website, you'll find lots of decks that have control somewhere in their name, but I guarantee 95% of these are mislabeled. People are very quick to call something control. There are many misconceptions about this playstyle, and apparently most players just don't understand what control is even about. You'll hear stuff like trying to stall the game, that's a control deck. Trying to ramp mana, that's control. Removing things, control. Playing really big spells, control. Drawing lots of cards or resupplying a lot, definitely control. Almost all of these are wrong. These may be present in a control deck, yes, but your net-decked Fen and Crowbar list is not control, just because you play a 5-mana card, or just because you have lots of cards in your reserve. So then, what is control? In some other TCGs, like Pokemon for example, it's been a long time now since there has really been any competitive control deck. There are some B tier or C tier decks, but it's not a very prevalent archetype. The archetype, however, in itself has a long and illustrious tradition rooted mainly in the first trading card game of all, Magic the Gathering. In order to find out what control is really about, we need to go back to the origins of that archetype. Almost 30 years ago, in 1996, Magic the Gathering saw the advent of what's considered the first ever control deck. Its strategy was about removing enemy threats with removal spells like Swords to Plowshares, or straight up stopping them from ever hitting the board with counterspells, and then eventually, sometimes after a long period of nothing happening, trying to win with a single creature, Serra Angel, of which there were only 2 in the deck as opposed to the 4 which would have been allowed. The plan would be to play the game until you draw one of these, trying to deal with everything your opponent does in the meantime, and then get it on the board and then very slowly kill your opponent by hitting them for 4 damage each turn, which is not much. And not much else would be happening in the game, because the entire rest of your deck was designed to counteract any plays your opponent might make. Other control decks would be even more extreme, committing fully to just removing everything and trying to eventually win by not playing any threats of their own, no, but because the game had been going on for so long that the opponent's deck was empty, and then they would lose because they couldn't draw. Of course, control as an archetype has evolved a lot since then. But these early examples make a point that many of the things we heard earlier, like ramping mana or playing big spells, they don't matter to control at all. Control is about devaluing. If you take anything away from this video, I'd like it to be this fact. It's devaluing. It's the polar opposite to aggro, not in the sense of how long your games are or how tall your curve is, but in the sense that you're not trying to pile on power to overwhelm your opponent, even though it may look overwhelming at times. In reality, a control player does the opposite. They try to take value out of everything happening in the game, nullifying enemy characters by removing them, countering their spells so that they don't ever happen. And once your opponent's strategy is completely harmless because it's been devalued so much, you can win even with the slightest bit of incremental advantage, doing 1 damage per turn, waiting for the opponent to run out of cards in their deck, or playing some sort of permanent that will win the game by itself but only in 10 turns. That's fine, take your pick. That's what control, classically, is about. Problems of control in Altered. Now, listening to all this, you might notice that in Altered, even in just the first set, we theoretically seem to have all the tools available to make a deck like this happen. There are multiple removal spells in each color, dealing both with characters and with permanents. There even is what's called a sweeper or board wipe in Kraken's Wrath, which deals with many characters at once. And most importantly, we have cards that provide some sort of incremental value to win the game with. Grand Endeavor comes to mind first. This is a card that will literally win you the game on its own if you manage to stop everything else from happening. But you don't need to go that high in mana cost. Ordis Carrier and Brassbach Hive can serve a similar purpose. Both are available in Izmir. If all you do is spend your resources to remove your enemy's resources and the board is constantly empty, then a small 1/1/1 recruit every round will win you expeditions. So why doesn't it work? We have all the pieces. Why is there no deck? Let's look at the Beyond the Gates card pool and discuss some of the problems you'll encounter if you want to play this archetype. I'll be focusing on Izmir Control specifically because it seems like the faction most suited for the Control playstyle, both thematically and in terms of gameplay philosophy, but these apply to other factions just the same. Number 1, starting out with a fundamental aspect of the game. In Altered, almost all game pieces are incredibly fleeting. And I don't mean in the sense of the ability fleeting. I mean in the sense that they stay on the board only for a very short time. Compare this to other games. In Magic the Gathering, even a small creature on the board will produce constant value for your opponent if you don't answer it, because it will be able to hit you for damage every round, accumulating more and more impact the longer it sticks around. In Pokemon, it's kind of the same thing, for example with abilities that you can activate each round. But in Altered, characters, so to say, serve their purpose by winning you an expedition and then they leave the board anyway. So just structurally speaking, it seems like investing resources into removing enemy threats has a much lower payoff than in other games, because they kind of remove themselves anyway. Obviously there are some exceptions like Hydrocana, or landmarks that give you continuous value and that you really want to get gone. But in general, why should I remove something if it will just remove itself at the end of the round anyway? Number 2. You'll find that removal spells are generally not very pushed in Beyond the Gates. That is to say, it seems the designers were not intending them to be very strong in the first place. There are 2 aspects that show this. The first one being that many removal spells have the fleeting property built into them. In Izmir there are some notable exceptions like Beauty Sleep and off you go, but most removal tools at your disposal like Boom, Intimidation, the Common Banishing Gate or Kraken's Wrath, they're all fleeting by themselves. Is that a problem? Yes and no. For something like Banishing Gate, you won't care, because you've traded one card in your hand and the mana to cast it for one card in the opponent's hand and the mana that they paid to cast that. It's an even trade, more or less, except that you'll probably have paid more mana than them. But you got rid of an important threat, and it's sort of even. The problem lies in the fact that most of these removal spells are not actually real removal, but rather bounces, to use the MTG term. Intimidation, Keylon Burst, or Sticky Note Seals all send the target character to reserve or to hand, while your spell goes into the discard pile. By the very nature of it, you're trading down, losing a card completely, while your opponent either gets a card into their reserve or, even worse, into their hand. That's like playing a spell that says your opponent draws a card. It's kind of insane. Thirdly, you'll also find that removal in Beyond the Gates is generally overcosted. This is also why Tough often seems like a pretty weak ability for characters to have. Really, the only cost-efficient removal spells seem to be the rare Mana Eruption and the rare Cloth Cocoon, which both come with considerable restrictions. As for commons, Spycraft and Teamwork Training seem somewhat efficient, even though their effects are weaker. Now you might say, hang on, isn't a card like Rare Sticky Note Seals incredibly cost efficient? You're paying 3 to deal with something that costs 4 or more. In a sense you'd be right, but you'd be missing that how much the card costs is actually not the only cost, so to speak, that you're paying. Even putting a card like Sticky Note Seals in your deck in the first place causes a considerable cost to you. Because as opposed to a character with stats, which is useful always, this is only usable in certain circumstances, because it has a condition that there needs to be a target for it. In general, it can be said that running a removal spell instead of a character is a downgrade to your deck. Which is also the reason why right now in the meta we're seeing all these decks that run a lot of small characters and just try to stall out each round by playing small stuff, playing it slow, and then win expeditions. So the point is, even if you ignore that removal spells are mostly fleeting, and that the targets would have left the battlefield anyway, and that you're probably trading down in hand cards, even then, there's an additional hidden cost to these spells, which is that they're only conditionally useful. So trading evenly in mana is not actually fair to you at all. Here are two very popular, very iconic removal spells from Magic the Gathering. The first is Fatal Push, which, as you can see, will destroy, as in discard in altered terms, any enemy character of cost 2 or less, but in practice, you're almost always using the second mode, where the target can be cost 4 or less. You're getting this effect for 1 mana. No fleeting, no sending to reserve or back to hand, just straight up pay 1, discard this to destroy one of their things. Or, second one, Leyline Binding. The relevant text here is that it's a permanent that sort of eats up or exiles any target at all until it itself gets destroyed. And while the mana cost is 6, it gets discounted in a major way, so in reality you're casting this for 1 or maybe 2 mana. Also, both of these cards can be played at what is called instant speed, which is a major upgrade to these cards, but that's a different matter. The point is, yes, of course, these are powerful all-stars, but there's nothing even remotely close to them in Altered right now. Right now, we're paying 4 for this effect with Banishing Gate, which is absurdly expensive. If your goal is to build a deck around removal spells, you better bring twice or 3 times as much mana as your opponent, because otherwise you won't stand the slightest chance. Fourth on my list, as I mentioned, we do theoretically have these game winner pieces that a control deck could be built around, most notably Grand Endeavor and Ordis Carrier, and they're both in Izmir. And I won't deny that playing an Ordis Carrier as your round 1 is a strong start for an Akesha deck, but at the same time, you're sacrificing 2 expeditions to get a skill that Sigismar gets for free, so yeah. Our hopes are on Grand Endeavor. But honestly, at 6 mana, the card is just too expensive. At that point in the game, you cannot afford to spend your entire round playing this instead of contesting expeditions. You'll just end up conceding 2 progressions and your opponent will have won the game. And if you're thinking, dude, you can't seriously want this to be cheaper than Rare Brassbuck Hive, right? Please reconsider. It's not comparable to the Rare Brassbuck Hive because of 2 key differences. Firstly, Hive contests the board by giving you a 3/3/3 bug when you play it, making it much more playable in the mid to late game than Grand Endeavor. And secondly, Axiom has many ways to get cost reduction for permanence. So if you're playing Subhash or Sierra built around Hive, you're getting this for 5, meaning it comes down on turn 3, which is not the late game at all, plus its built-in 3/3/3 bug, or in Sierra's case, 2 of them hit the board and help you out that round right away. And this is another real problem for Izmir Control. You have these game winner late game drops like Endeavor or Cardigear or even Ether Shard, but you have no way of making them cheaper, like Axiom has. And you also can't ramp in Izmir. So these high-costed cards are actually way too expensive for your humble means, and there's no way for you to get around that. Another thing that's a big problem for Izmir Control, and one which has traditionally been a huge problem for Control in MTG as well, are so-called ETB effects, ETB being short for enters the battlefield, which is another MTG term. In Altered, you'd have to call them FHFR, from hand from reserve. Ratatoskr and Ordis Gatekeeper are examples of this, but there's a critical difference between these 2 cards. Both characters come down and immediately give you strong value due to their from hand or from reserve effects. But consider what that means for you as a control player who's looking to answer these threats. For Ratatoskr, it doesn't really matter to you. The character is suddenly a 4/4/4 instead of a 1/1/1, sure, but your Off You Go or Intimidation will work just as well. Ordis Gatekeeper, though, has more or less completely countered your entire life once the opponent plays it, because now there are 3 characters on the board. Go ahead and use your Off You Go now, and just proceed to lose both expeditions. Fantastic. The point is that this theoretical plan of answering all your opponent's threats with equal counter cards of your own breaks down very quickly once you have cards that trigger when they're played. And as you know, there's a lot of those. Because even if you answer the card, your opponent will already have gotten the ETB effect, be it Sabotage or an additional token or whatever. You simply won't be able to keep up with your overcosted removal spells. Now imagine how awful your Akesha Control matchup must be if your opponent happens to play a hero that just gives them free characters all the time anyway. Your only outs are board wipe effects, which we'll come back to in a minute. Now, 6th item on my list If you, like me, come from a background in Magic the Gathering where Control has its home, there's another thing you'll probably sorely miss for your Control player toolbox: counterspells. These are an important part of Magic the Gathering and are classically thought of as the answer to the enter the battlefield value cards, because you play them as a reaction when your opponent attempts to play something, which allows you to nullify that play so that it doesn't even happen. Now, at first you might feel like that's not so different to a removal spell, but there are important details that make counterspells very different indeed, actually, in practice. One of them being, as we've mentioned, that you can prevent cards like Tanuki or Ortis Gatekeeper or Tooth Fairy to trigger their instant effects. Sadly, there is nothing of that sort at all in Altered, and it doesn't seem like there will be for the foreseeable future. As the game stands right now, you don't have any ways to react to your opponent's plays, or play cards during your opponent's turn, or any sort of interaction on the stack, as is commonplace in MTG, because there is no stack. The only card in the game that sort of goes in that direction is the Council, and it's really not good. Besides that, the only thing I could remotely imagine happening would be some sort of character in an upcoming set that you play, and then when your opponent plays their next card, it will trigger and interact with it in some way, but that seems like a very optimistic hope. Second to last point on my list, and another thing that would be really nice to have in the Control toolbox in Altered, is hand hate. That is to say, cards that interact with the opponent's hand. And I don't mean Daughter of Yggdrasil. Right now, the only piece of hand hate in Altered is Baku, which provides you with the most basic kind of hand interaction, making the opponent discard a card of their choice. Kind of the negative opposite of you drawing a card with Baba Yaga. But hang on, if it's the exact negative opposite of you drawing a card with Baba Yaga, then why doesn't it cost the same? Why this discrimination against control effects? And actually it's even worse than that, because you drawing a card always helps you, while making the opponent discard has a chance to fail, namely when they don't have any cards in their hand. Even if you're the starting player, this might well happen if you're up against a deck like Subhash. So it's safe to say that hand hate is underrepresented in Beyond the Gates. For inspiration, here are two classic kinds of hand hate from Magic the Gathering. Burglar Rat, an example of many such characters that make your opponent discard a card when they enter the field, attached to a 1/1 body. Notice how this costs 2 mana, compared to our Baku's 4? Yeah. Another even more classic hand hate piece though, Thoughtseize, where your opponent reveals their hand and you choose which card they discard, for 1 mana. That's an upgrade in a major way, and it comes with the additional upside that you get to see the opponent's hand, which is a big plus for a Control player. Now, granted, this is one of the strongest interaction pieces in MTG. It's been popular for decades, but my point is that there is nothing remotely like it in Altered so far. I feel like for 4 mana, Baku could well have had a Thoughtseize style effect instead of a Burglar Rat style one. But that's just my opinion. And finally, I want to quickly note that, technically speaking, there are 2 other archetypes of control we haven't discussed yet, besides the one I defined earlier. In Magic the Gathering, these are called Stacks and Prison. Stacks is a playstyle where you use cards like our Robin Hood that make playing the game more expensive for your opponent, or like the Council, which stops certain triggers from happening. Your goal is to sort of make it impossible for your opponent to play the game effectively, since everything they do is so expensive, or because so many of their effects are suddenly tied to certain conditions or they're stopped altogether, that they can't really play. Prison, on the other hand, is a type of combo where originally you would try to set something up like all your cards are considered to be of card type X, and combine it with you can't play cards of card type X. Put that on your opponent and they're locked out of the game entirely. There are many other more moderate types of prison, but that's the general idea. You set up some sort of loophole that prevents them from doing anything. Both Stacks and Prison are utterly infeasible in Altered right now with the current card pool. Apart from Robin Hood and certain uniques that increase the costs, there are simply not enough play pieces to make these archetypes happen. It's honestly pretty unlikely that they will ever be playable, because these kinds of strategies are known to create a lot of displeasure among players, so the designers of Altered will think twice about ever leaning into that sort of direction. How should you play Akesha then? So in summary, these 8 problems contribute to traditional control not being playable. But wait, Kojo main, how can this be? I've been playing Akesha for 2 weeks now and I've won 95% of my games. Hey Kojo main, I just won my local tournament with an Akesha list. Control is so good. Well, first of all, congrats for apparently being the best players on the planet. I can't believe how much the people in my comments are winning. On a more serious note, I don't mean to say that Akesha as a hero is bad, or that Izmir as a color is unplayable. I just claim that traditional control isn't quite there yet in Beyond the Gates. So as a small detour, let's dive into the question quickly of how should you play Akesha then? In the absence of hardcore control, which Akesha's hero power seems to be naturally suited for, there is another playstyle you can play with her that is very strong and makes use of her after you in another potent way. This archetype is known as Zigzag, and it was popularized by a Discord user called Niche on the official Altered Discord server. The idea is to always trade expeditions by making use of going second every round, ideally resulting in 1-for-1 trades of progressions every round. You can make that happen while spending relatively few resources, since going second makes it very easy. And then eventually, when the game is at match point, you try to steal the game by winning the decisive round with a trick like Beauty Sleep or Small Step Giant Leap. Right now, in the current set, that is definitely the way to play Akesha. It's hard to say if true control would even be stronger, since this archetype makes very clever use of Altered's mechanics and uses her hero power exceedingly well. It's really rather nice. Given that my plans for making an Izmir control video went down the drain, I think this is the next deck archetype that I want to feature in a gameplay video of mine, so stay tuned for that. So what's needed to make control playable in Altered? Now, as my last talking point for this video, we've discussed all the problems facing control, so let's imagine what would be new additions to the game that would really solve these problems. What kinds of new cards are control players looking for in upcoming sets? I've put together 4 ideas that would really help this archetype out. Number 1, we need removal that actually trades well. Banishing Gate is a good example of a spell that trades well, but it's far too expensive for what it does. Cheaper alternatives, like Cloth Cocoon for example, are fleeting, so they don't trade well. What is needed is 1 or 2 spells that cost 2 or 3, reliably discard a character, and are not fleeting. So here's Goth UO. Discarding only characters, not landmarks, but actually doing it well, at a rate that is worth it for us to play. Number 2, actual board wipes. That is to say, spells that remove all characters. Or to put it differently, cards that trade up, as in 1 card for 3 opponent characters, or something like that. Kraken's Wrath, the only board wipe in the game right now, is far too weak. The fact that it's fleeting could be acceptable if it actually wiped the board, but it only wipes a part of the board, so it's unplayable for 5 mana, which is, in most cases your whole turn. Compared to a full board wipe, it may have the advantage of not hitting your own characters, which is classically considered a very strong aspect, but the card doesn't achieve its purpose, so that part doesn't help much. I would prefer Raken's Crath, which sends all characters to reserve, both players. It costs 4 mana, and it has fleeting. Number 3. Since counter magic is not a thing in Altered, and it will never be probably, at least good hand hate would be nice. Give us some way of preventing our opponents from playing these strong enter the battlefield effects. Imagine Foof Terry. A 2-mana character, 1/1/1, like Tooth Fairy, but instead of sabotaging, it sends a card of your choice from the opponent's hand to reserve, or to the bin maybe. Baku is far too tame, since it doesn't even let you pick the card, and it's overcosted for what it does. But with a small utility character like this, you could try to snatch expeditions while attacking the opponent's hand, which would be very useful for a control playstyle. And number 4, finally, a better direct way of just preventing ETB triggers would be nice. The Council doesn't do that very well, and it's only in 2 colors, so Izmir can't make use of it. What I'm looking for is some kind of landmark that interacts with opponents' triggers. Something like the Body Gear Kizmir Astion, an expensive landmark that would provide a strong anti-trigger effect. You might feel like this would be too strong, but I fear it would need to be this impactful, or otherwise you would never invest the mana. I have to admit, some of these ideas are pretty unlikely to actually happen. But who knows? Maybe in a year or so, I'll look back on this and be surprised how many of those I predicted correctly, especially the names. We'll see. If you ask me, chances are pretty good for Control players to get additional play pieces in the upcoming sets. If you think about it, Control is thought of as a bit of an annoying playstyle, so it's easy to see why the designers of Altered didn't want to feature it strongly in the first set. Once we get into the following sets though, it's bound to show up more prominently. So those are my thoughts, people. Again, I really feel like Control is a buzzword thrown around a whole lot in the deck building community right now, and many people don't seem to have a well-founded idea of what it's actually about. So I hope this little video essay can help clear some of that up. To be perfectly honest, it's somewhat unclear whether or not it's a good idea to push Control in future sets, given that many players really hate playing against this kind of archetype. So even if technically it's not too strong, players tend to dislike it much more than other kinds of decks. But on one hand, it's just the first set and we already have decks that everybody hates, so that's not a problem. That's gonna happen anyway. And on the other hand, personally, I feel like some sort of Control deck should be in the meta somewhere. So I'm looking forward to future sets and what kinds of tools we might get there for this kind of strategy. Guys, thanks for watching. If you have any ideas about your own cool card designs that might be needed for Control to be playable, or other aspects of the topic that I didn't mention, make sure to tell me in the comments. I'd love to take a look and have a little discussion. As always, I hope you have a great time, and I'll see you in the next video.